Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're viewing this from. Welcome to our first session on how to achieve compliance, not in a technical specialty, but in the way we use language, specifically in the data management realm. Today you're looking at part one, how to portray business itself without regard to any technology. The second presentation will be more concerned with that technology. The presentation will emphasize how we human beings use language. How we use language is important. Here you have Alice out in the woods with a portable home appliance, and she's concerned. The woods were dark and foreboding, and Alice sensed that the sinister eyes were watching her every step. Worst of all, she knew that nature abhors a vacuum. Now about language. We data architects, modelers, consultants, designers, etc., are dedicated to helping clients use language. Indeed, different parts of an organization use language in different ways. They have the same thing that means different things, different names that mean the same things. Am I right? Not only does this make it difficult for people to communicate, but it's even worse for interconnected systems. Now, we data types are quick to criticize our clients for getting the vocabularies concerned. But what about us? What do we mean by conceptual data model? Today we're going to find at least three different definitions for that one. Logical data model. It may not be what you think. Physical data model. The latter two will be the subject of our next presentation. Can we at least be consistent among ourselves? Now, today's session is about the June 2018 book, Achieving Buzzword Compliance, Data Architecture, Language and Vocabulary by yours truly, with a foreword by my friend John Sackman. First, allow me to introduce myself. As you must know by now, my name is David C. Hay. In my private life, I'm a philosopher and origamist. Actually, origamist doesn't sound right. Paper folder. But for you guys, consider me a data modeling virtuoso. I fear that is me being immodest, but my daughter is an opera singer and I like the sound of it. Whether I'm entitled to that title or not is my obligation to demonstrate to you in this presentation. First of all, some history. Early in my career, I designed and implemented manufacturing, inventory, and control systems, otherwise known as MRP. MRP is a piece of software that converts a product sales forecasts over time to correspondingly timed requirements for producing or purchasing components of that product, net of any existing inventory. Even in the 1970s, the requirement for accurate data, in this case inventory values, was a big deal. Altogether, I spent about 10 years at it. After I got my MBA in 1975, my first job was with Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company. For this project, I was required to go to the plant in Brooklyn and determine how the plant produced and used information. To do this, I needed a language. Let's call it a notation to describe what was going on. For the first 6 months of this assignment, creating a viable process modeling notation was a struggle. Fortunately, in 1979, Trish Sarson and Chris Gain came up with the idea of a data flow diagram, also called the DFD, which was exactly what I was looking for. Then in 1984, Steve McMenamin and John Palmer refined this to come up with the idea of an essential data flow diagram. I spent 5 years at Pfizer, followed by 5 years as a New Jersey chemical company, using DFDs to plan for production and inventory control systems. Now, the only problem with the DFD was that however skillfully I might have represented the current process flows, the particular structure of those flows will change with the times, and the drawings would become out of date. So in 1986, I went to work for the Oracle Corporation, producing data models. It was here that I discovered the advantages of not modeling data processes, but instead of modeling data structure. Yes, I learned to create essential, also called conceptual data models. Now, mind you, a data model is not about what a company does, which will change over time, but rather about the underlying nature of the company itself, which is less likely to change. Not only that, Oracle introduced me to a combination of language and aesthetics that allowed me to present the models to management at any level so that they could agree or disagree with their correctness. So far, I've spent about 35 years doing that. You'll hear more about that as we go along. Now, throughout my career, it became clear to me that there are better and worse ways of organizing data. Moreover, software applications will either support or sabotage the enterprise based on the effectiveness of that database design. That is, the secret to managing any enterprise is the management of information. Now, throughout the 1970s, different companies tried to create a standardized approach to database management. In 1971, Dr. Ted Codd presented his ideas about organizing data in terms of simple two-dimensional tables. Then in 1976, the Oracle Corporation, among others, finally created products that made commercial use of Dr. Codd's work. From all this, and from the decades following, while working in the database modeling world, I came to understand that, regardless of the specialties involved, the secrets to managing any enterprise is recognizing and managing data as a corporate asset. And this entire conversation was a significant part of all 50 years of my career. Note also that in all of this, I was accompanied and assisted by the Data Administration Management Association, DAMA International. Oh, and in the course of my career, I have in fact written some other books. In 1995, shortly after I'd founded my company, I wrote Data Model Patterns, Conventions of Thought. Now, I didn't expect it, but this book turned out to be a breakthrough in the market for business-oriented data model patterns. By 1990, the object-oriented world flourished, and one of the topics of the day was object-oriented systems analysis. No. First, there is systems analysis. Okay, let's call that requirements analysis. What are the problems that confront the enterprise? Only after you've determined what problems you're trying to address can you come up with an object-oriented solution or a relational solution or even a COBOL solution. So, since I'd had a few years' experience on the subject, by then I wrote this book in 2003, Requirements Analysis from Business Views to Architecture. Now, since metadata were at the heart of my efforts, it seemed appropriate for me to submit my take on the subject. My book was called Data Model Patterns, a Metadata Map. These were patterns describing the structure of the elements of various kinds of data models. The object management group had tried to create such a meta model, but it didn't quite get it. In 2001, I wrote the second edition of my data model patterns work. This one attempted to be a bit more comprehensive than the first one. Now, with any model of the world, you have a basic design decision to make. If the patterns are not abstract enough, they aren't generally applicable. Too abstract, and no one can understand them. Now, in my first patterns book, I had to use my judgment as to how abstract models should be. Based on reviews, I'd say they were pretty good. Over the years, however, I've created many models based on more concrete examples. In my 2011 version, then, I took on the notion of level of abstraction itself. This book presents the world in 4 levels of abstraction. I will cover this in more detail. I have spent way too much time with the OMG people. They argue that UML, the Unified Modeling Language, is a notation that will conquer the world. Anything you can represent in an ERD, Entity Relationship Diagram, you can represent better in a UML class diagram. Well, not exactly. It turns out that UML does not define the structure of data, as does the ERD. It describes associations between classes, to be sure. These are not in terms of structure, however, but of the processes that manipulate them. This is very different, and it produces very different models. It took me several years of not understanding the object-oriented way of thinking before I finally figured out the implications of that distinction. Once I'd done so, I was created and compelled to write UML and Data Modeling, a Reconciliation. Once you recognize this distinction, you can make it work, if you insist. Now, to use UML as a conceptual modeling tool, as opposed to an object-oriented one, you simply have to follow different rules for naming what they call associations, to make them into structural relationships. Oh, and you should also follow aesthetic rules. More about this later. Now, once I understood the underlying distinctions, I could present the patterns in my Enterprise Model Patterns book using my version of the UML notation. That is, I used my standard for naming relationships plus my standard for aesthetics. And, of course, in 2018, there was achieving Buzzword compliance. In 1993, I formed my company. It has now provided leadership in data architecture for almost 30 years. It has served many different industries. In addition to the ones mentioned here, it also addressed banking, television, and criminal justice, to name just a few. Now, originally it was called Essential Strategies Incorporated, but after work in Mexico, Canada, Bahrain, London, and Paris, I concluded that it really was international. Particular skills include using Occam's razor to detect the underlying simplicity behind very complex organizations. We'll hear more about that in a few minutes. Now, about the buzzword in buzzword compliance. The data architecture field is rife with terms that have become fashionable. As they spread, the definitions become muddy, converting them into buzzwords. Other terms in our industry still have their precise original meanings. They haven't become buzzwords. Let's head them off. Our assignment today: achieving buzzword compliance, the state where each of us both understands and agrees to the concrete meanings of terms, especially as used in the data architecture field. Okay, I do believe that you can all understand what I will present here. On the other hand, if you do not agree with the definition or concept presented here, please let me know. It's pity that this medium does not let you tell me in person, at least right now. So I've set up a special address for this presentation, buzzword@davehay.com. Or do feel free to call me at the phone number shown. About dissent. Unlike certain politicians I can think of, I am not offended by dissent. If you disagree with me, please say so, or at least write to me. Either you can contribute to my body of knowledge, or I can teach you something new. Either way, we both win. However, and this is maybe the tough part, you and I both have to come to it with open minds. Raw materials. Here you have the terms we are going to cover today. Just a few. Semantic Web, Logical Model, Aristotelian Glossary, Conceptual Model, and so on and so forth. Now, arriving at a consistent use of language. You should understand this presentation is about a particular set of terms and definitions. The idea is to rationalize all the ways these terms are defined, based on the history of each term, underlying logic, okay, some personal prejudice, but I have a lot of experience, and it is my show after all. Oh, by the way, OMG has a model-driven approach that has a very similar structure, but of course they have very different names for the same things. One caution. For each of you, some of these topics will be quite familiar. Each topic, however, will be new to some of you. My objective here is to describe enough for novices to understand each term and how it relates to other terms, and for the more experienced to perhaps see each term possibly in a new light. Of course, to learn any concept completely is beyond the scope of this presentation. This will call for other sessions and textbooks. For this, you are invited to check out the bibliography of today's book. Okay, the first buzzword tonight is data modeling. Now, data modelers are concerned with underlying structure and language as used in enterprise. These are business-oriented. Data architect designers are concerned with the design of particular kinds of databases. These are technology-oriented, which are you. Finally, an agenda for today's presentation. Part 1 is this presentation. First, you'll see more context, more coherent. 3 proposed kinds of business models. Then part 2 is another presentation. 3 proposed kinds of technology-oriented models. Spoiler alert, the concept logical data models doesn't come up until part 2. Part 1, context. In 1975, the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, came up with 3 ways to look at data. Each of us comes to his job with a particular mental map of the world. This is an array of things that we've learned throughout our lives, plus the relationships among them that we understand to be true. This mental map is called by ANSI an external schema. It's okay if you claim this whole presentation is Greek to you, as the saying goes, because in this case it is. The word schema is originally Greek, meaning diagram or plan. Of course, in the original Greek, the plural of schema isn't schemas, it's schemata, but that's probably too Greek. Anyway, the ANSI approach begins with each player's external schema. This consists not only of the player's life history, but also the particular circumstances and events from the job. The point is that it is different for each of the players. Charlie, for example, over there, has brought to the company a very different mental map, a different external schema. And George, of course, has his own. And that's just three. Imagine your company. Mind you, if the three of you or more are working in different parts of the organization, the problem is even worse. Now, anyone confronted with an infant for the first time must wonder how it is that human beings manage to start life with no user guide. If this is a question that interests you, I recommend this wonderful book by Douglas Hofstadter and Emmanuel Sander called Services and Essences. Analogy is the fire and fuel of thinking. It takes up this very question. Apparently, every small human being is born with inborn skills, not with language per se, but at building categories and analogies. He or she then uses these skills little by little to formulate what, for them, are coherent views of the world. Now, Nancy's view of the world, however different these external schemas may be, if they are all views of the same organization, somewhere in there must be a single conceptual schema that encompasses all of them. That is, each element in each external schema is represented in the single enterprise-wide conceptual schema. Note that however many external schemas are added, each would have minimal impact on the conceptual schema. They may add to it, but should not affect its underlying structure. Note, however, that the conceptual schema does not represent the actual bits and bytes that describe the way data might be stored in a machine. Since there are any number of ways that a conceptual schema may be implemented, the ANSI arrangement shows on the right side how one or more internal schemas may be derived from it. Depending on the technology involved, an internal schema may be for a relational database, while another may be for a COMAL program's data division. In fact, in the last decades, it has been discovered there are not one, but two distinct categories of internal schema. The first one is in terms of the same concepts from the conceptual schema, but these are concepts that are organized in terms of a particular approach to database management. For historical reasons, this is called the logical schema, and is further explained in the Part 2 presentation. Now this year, in 2022, the most common kinds of logical schemas are relational, object-oriented, and NoSQL. There are in fact half a dozen others as well, as will be covered in Part 2 presentation. Of course, next year there will be something else. On the other hand, if you will get into the specifics of how tables are going to be implemented and stored in a particular vendor's database, you're describing one or more physical schemas. Here you can talk about table spaces and partitions, for example. This also is where you denormalize the logical structures to accommodate physical constraints. Thus, instead of 3 schemas, you get 4 schemata. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Note, by the way, the semantic independence of these groupings. If the collection of external schemas changes, that should have minimal impact on the conceptual schema and none at all on the logical or physical schemas. Alternatively, if the technology on the right side of the diagram changes, that should have minimal impact on the conceptual schema and none at all on the external schemas. In 1987, John Zachman published the first version of his Framework for Information System Architectures. This version had only 3 columns, but in 1992, he and John Soa expanded it to all 6 of the columns we will see today. Then in 2011, he refined the whole thing and renamed it to the Framework for Enterprise Architecture. I'd like to think that this was with some encouragement from yours truly. Mr. Zachman's original insight was recognizing and reflecting different perspectives on information architecture. These he set out as rows in a matrix. Beginning at the top, he cited the perspective taken by Chief Executive, looking at the enterprise as a whole. This is the perspective that recognizes the identity that is what the enterprise means to the world. From here, he moved to the business manager. the one who gets the work done. This could be a shop foreman, an accounts receivable manager, or an inventory control manager. This person's perspective is concerned with creating the inventory definitions that constitute the language that makes it all work. The third perspective is that of the architect. This is the one who takes the business manager's definitions of the enterprise's language and represents this language in terms of the fundamental concepts or the basis for its structure across departments and disciplines. Now note that none of these perspectives deal with technology. All three of these perspectives represent the views of the business itself. Indeed, these are the terms of information that is at the heart of each view. It is the next three perspectives that will deal with technology. The first of these technological perspectives is that of the designer. This is the individual who translates the architect's visions of fundamental concepts into inventory specifications of programs or database designs. These designs are specified in detail. The second technological perspective is that of the technician. This is the person who takes the designer specifications, what is the program or database design supposed to accomplish, and translates them into configurations or program code, database table spaces and partitions, and so on. The final perspective is that of the enterprise as a whole. This is the one that will make use of the products of the technicians. If this view is describing all the components of a working enterprise, its perspective is about the future, the instantiation of a new world. So if these perspectives represent rows in a framework, what about the other dimension, the columns? What people see? What is each of these perspectives looking at? Now for the columns in the matrix, we're going to need some help from Rudyard Kipling. Okay, this is not exactly current. Written in 1902, it's from the short story Elephant's Child, written by him for the children's book Just So Stories. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when, and how and where and who. Note that these are exactly the interrogatives that journalists are taught to include in the lead paragraph of any story they are writing. So now we get to see the full frame matrix that is the Zachman framework. The columns are defined as what? Inventory. What are the things that the enterprise deals with? Why? Motivation. What causes the enterprise to do what it does, beginning with the vision of the enterprise as a whole, continuing with the mission of each part, and continuing through the definition of business rules throughout. When? Timing. When do things happen in the enterprise? Not only in terms of schedules, but also in terms of the external events that cause them. How? Process. How does the enterprise perform activities from large projects to detailed tasks? Where? Distribution. On the macro level, where in the world does the enterprise do business? On a more detailed level, where in a warehouse is a part to be found? And finally, who? Responsibility. Who are the people and organizations that are the enterprise? Moreover, who are the agents, customers, vendors, shippers, and so forth with which it deals? Note that each column, there is a cell for each row that describes the column. These are the identification, definitions, representation, specifications, configuration, and instantiation of the concepts that constitute the column. Now, for our purposes in this description, we're going to focus on the what column. This is the one that primarily describes the things of the enterprise, its inventory. Data figure very strongly in this column. We will be describing each of these cells in more detail as we go along, but first, here's what they are. Note that each cell is indeed the intersection of the row and column. Row 1, column 1, thus had to be inventory identification. What concepts are constituents of the identity of the enterprise? From this identity is derived the scope of further development action. Now in column 1, business managers row, you get the definitions of every term that describes an inventory element in the enterprise. This is in the context of the scope provided in row 1. In column 1 architect's view, you get the clearest possible representation of the enterprise inventory elements, the ones that were defined in row 2. In column 1 engineer's row, you get the architect's elements from row 3 translated into design elements, tables, columns, files, etc. And then in column 1, technicians convert the inventory specifications from row 3 into real databases and real programs. In the column 1 enterprise model as a whole, this then takes ownership of the work that was accomplished by the technicians in row 5. Note that this column is not a system development lifecycle. For that, you would have to look at the processes described in column 2. In column 1, at each level, you would simply have a view of the enterprise in specific terms that ideally will have been translated from one level to the next, beginning with row 1. Thus, the primary activity in column 1 is translation from one row to the next. Translation required from the language of the business managers to make it understood by the architects. Translation is required from the architects to make them understood by the engineers. And translation is required from the language of the engineers to make them understood by the technicians. And of course, the workings of the final product produced by the technicians must be made available to all of the users in the enterprise in order to use those products. Now, in terms of the ANSI architecture we discussed earlier, the business manager's definitions comprise a set of external schemas. The architect's view consists of the conceptual schema. The engineers provide one or more specifications, and the technicians configure this, the final physical schemas, to be delivered to the enterprise. That was a lot of time just to provide context. It is to be hoped that time was spent on that will make the rest of this flow more easily. Specifically, we are now going to propose 3 kinds of business data models: the overview model, the semantic model, and the essential model. Now in more detail. First, the overview model. This provides context from top management's point of view. Wide-ranging, but with relatively little detail. This is what Steve Hoberman calls the conceptual model. Semantic model. This model is in terms of the business language as used by the people in the business. It is the vehicle for identifying semantic conflicts. Since it is highly detailed, Oracle calls this the divergent model, and John Zachman in his original work called this the conceptual model. Essential model is a term that I've taken for this. It's in terms of fewer, more general, more abstract terms. This means that these general categories should cross departmental boundaries. Since it is relatively compact, we'll call it the convergent model. Graham Simpson, Graham Witt, and yours truly like to call this model the conceptual model. Spoiler alert! All 3 of these are kinds of conceptual model. Okay, so what exactly do we mean by the conceptual data model? First, it is a reasonably complete, detailed description of a domain, which is to say, an area of interest. It is not necessarily an overview, unless that is what is agreed to be what it is. More of that in a moment. It is in terms of business, not technology. That is, it's in terms of the classes of things of significance to the enterprise. These things of significance are the concepts. Hence, we are concerned with conceptual model. Where present, each one-to-many relationship represents 2 assertions about the nature of the enterprise. The corporate overview. This is where we start the conversation with top management. The scope is the entire enterprise, or perhaps one division, based on the motivation column, which had the vision and the mission. This sets the priorities for any upcoming systems efforts. This is a sketch of the environment. That is to say, the most important kinds of data required to manage the enterprise. These are global things of significance, connected with many-to-many relationships. Probably no more than a dozen boxes. The object management group calls this the environment model. Getting started. The overview model is about the executive, which is concerned with the identity of the business, basically in terms of business concepts, and the vehicle is a sketch, maybe a whiteboard sketch, of a simple entity relationship model. Section 2, row 2, is the semantic model. I love BC. How goes the beans training? Great, watch this. He issues the command heal. And the dog is looking kind of puzzled. Heal. Clamp. Okay, maybe that's not what he meant. Next week we start on semantics. What is semantics? Semantics is the theory of meaning, the signification of signs or symbols, not the formal relationships among them. That's syntactics. The semantic model, in turn, is about the language of the enterprise, as used. Note that different groups are going to come up with different sets of definitions. This means that the process will be required to resolve semantic conflicts. For example, there will probably not be a particular group establishing its definition as true for the entire enterprise. Rather, to the extent that there are different definitions in different departments for one term, the variations must at least be addressed and documented. There are two forms for the semantic model. First is graphic. We're going to draw pictures. The second is in terms of text. Okay, starting with the graphic representation, we're going to start with entity relationship diagrams, and then something called object role modeling, which is the same idea coming from a different direction. Now, the entity relationship diagram, or ER diagram, is first of all concerned with entities and entity types. People often confuse these terms. I'm here to give you the straight scoop. First, an entity is anything. It is a thing of significance about which you wish to hold information. The projector in your room is an entity. So are each of you. So is the room itself. Note that each entity is uniquely identifiable. This is not to be confused with the entity type. This is a class or category of those things. The concept of projector is an entity type. So is person. So is room. Note that today we are going to draw pictures that represent entity types, not individual entities. Note that Dr. Peters Chen, back in 1976, made this distinction clearly in his specification of the first standard data modeling notation. The problem is that data modelers got lazy over the years and started calling the boxes on the drawings entities, and when necessary, talking about an instance of an entity when talking about one of the things itself. But then in 1990, the object-oriented crowd came along and said, hey, we're better than you. We know the difference between an object and a class. No, you don't. We know that your object is our entity, your class is our entity type. So in the interest of clarifying communications, perhaps instead of entity type, we should call it entity class. For example, here there are a collection of entity types. The box vendor represents a class of people and organizations that are available to sell stuff to you. This class could include IBM, Starbucks, or even you, the viewer. Later we will see how this particular class is defined. The next term to be defined is attribute. This is the definition of an element describing that class. Here are attributes, kinds of information that you want to hold for each entity in that entity type. For example, purchase order is described in this model as being described by PO number, PO issue date, and PO completed date. Later, we will describe the symbols next to each attribute. Now, you'll notice in this drawing you have one box that has other boxes inside it. These are examples of subtypes. That is, a subtype is a subset of the instances of the entity type. It's supertype. On the drawing, you have city, state, and country, all as subtypes of the supertype geographic area. Specifically, here, state is a subtype of geographic area. This means, by definition, that each instance of a state must also be an instance of the supertype geographic area. Now, for those of you familiar with other notations for entity relationship models, such as information engineering or ORs with UML, you will have seen subtypes represented by boxes outside the supertype boxes, connected with lines. So be it. For today's session, however, we will be seeing what Richard Barker and Harry Ellis proposed. The advantage of this approach is that it is graphically clear that each instance of the subtype really is, in fact, an instance of the supertype. It isn't just a distant cousin or relation. Now for the lines that link the entity types together, relationships. Each relationship line represents a pair of assertions about the nature of how one instance of one entity is related to instances of the other. The fellows I mentioned on the last slide, Richard Barker and Harry Ellis, have very specific rules for forming and naming relationships. For example, hidden on this drawing are two strong assertions. Note that each may be true or false. For example, each sales order may be composed of one or more SO line items, each of which must be to sell one and only one product type. Now, it's a very simple English language sentence. It's not for the data modeler to know whether those statements are true or not. That's the subject matter expert. The wording of these sessions, however, makes it easy to present this mode to experts to determine whether they are true or not. Indeed, this sentence in two parts is shown directly on this diagram. Each sales order may be, because it's a dashed line, composed of, and one or more, because there's a little crow's foot symbol there, SO line item. Each SO line item, in turn, must be, solid line, to sell one and only one, because there's no crow's foot, product type. Okay, indeed, this is exactly the sentence that we had below. Two observations. Observation 1, aesthetics. Notice, no bent lines. Each is only straight from one entity type to the other. Crow's feet show up in the upper left. This has the effect of providing shape, meaning transactions are all in the upper left and reference entity types are in the lower right. Two observations, readability. Readable sentences. For example, each sales order may be composed of one or more SO line items. Is each assertion clearly true or false? Can you have a sales order that has no line items? Well, that depends on your business. Maybe so, maybe not. Now, because it's defined the way it is, each SO line item is defined to be of one sales order, defined to be of one product type. So that's part of the structure of what's there. Now, what does the relationship mean? It's very easy to read well-defined relationship. Coming up with those names and making them exactly right requires a strong ability to understand the underlying meaning of what you're talking about. This does not come from a computer science degree, but from some education in, shall we say, philosophy or literature. Think, great literature is easy to read, or at least rewarding to read. Great literature is hard to write. Okay, now as much as I focus on aesthetics, that's not the point. The point is that the objective is not to make a beautiful drawing. The objective is to be wrong. It's only if you're wrong here and get this fixed that you have reduced the likelihood of being wrong when you design something or wish you deliver something. I'm a big fan of Gilbert. Here he is conducting a presentation, not unlike this one. As you can clearly see in slide 397, PowerPoint poisoning. Yes, indeed. It is probably about time to take a break. Press pause, stand up, walk around, do whatever you have to do. Come back and start again. We're still working on the semantic model, and it's the text representation that we're going to cover next. Specifically, glossary, something called the semantics of business vocabulary and rules, and the semantic web. Starting with the glossary. An enterprise's glossary is a catalog of the terms used to carry out its business. For example, it might be a thing of significance to the enterprise, for example, an entity type name, or it could describe an activity, then it would probably be a process name, or it could be about something else entirely. Now, the glossary document has a limited ability to describe how things are related to each other. This is pretty much limited to simple references like see also. So, what is a definition? In all my work with people trying to come up with a glossary, I am always surprised at how few were ever told how to do this. It is true that in all the English classes I had when I was growing up, there was never a section on how to create a definition. The thing is, it's not that hard. Aristotle figured out how to do it 2,300 years ago. Okay, he did it in Greek, but the principles still apply. There are two kinds of definitions. One that concerns us is the intrinsic. This is in terms of what Aristotle called essential characteristics. Specify the category the term is in. Followers of Aristotle in the Middle Ages gave this the Latin name genus. For example, an automobile is defined as a kind of vehicle. Second, say what kinds of characteristics differentiate this term from all others in this category. In the Middle Ages, followers of Aristotle gave this the Latin name differentia. For example, an automobile is defined as a kind of vehicle that is used to carry passengers. An extrinsic information, on the other hand, is where most of us start the process. Here the definition is simply a list of values. Where this might be a good place to collect your thoughts, it is not as satisfactory as a final result. For example, for a U.S. resident, the Immigration Department wanted to define the kinds of relatives that could be invited to stay in this country along with the legal resident. This turned out to be unsatisfactory. An immediate family member of a person is defined as a parent, a sibling, a spouse, or a child of that person. Well, this didn't work. It's all well and good, but immigrants from some countries were adamant that grandparents should go into this list. What about in-laws, cousins? The point is that there is rarely a list of values for any term that could radically capture its true definition. Now, some academics have provided many intricate rules for clearly making the definition. Robert Garp, B. Smith, A. Sminner defined a set of rules in their book, Building Ontologies with Basic Formal Ontologies. We're only going to take some of those for our purposes today. The first is use the intrinsic version that we just talked about. Second, do not define a word in terms of itself. I'm sure you've come up with things like this. An order number is the number of an order. No. This is what's called a tautology. Now, the definition of tautology does not show up in the dictionary as tautology, see tautology, but you get the idea. Use simpler terms than the term you are defining. For example, an automobile is a velocipede. No, that's not going to work. Make the definition unpackable. What this means is that the definitions should be substitutable for the defined term. For example, if a contract is defined as a business arrangement for the supply of goods or services, you should be able to say a business arrangement for the supply of goods or services is to be issued at a fixed price. The meaning of terms is extremely important. You're out riding in the mountains and you see a sign that says, look out ahead, and you say, aha, an opportunity to stop the car and view the scenery. No, that's not what it means. What it meant was, look out! Our next text representative is something we're calling the Semantics of Business Vocabulary and Rules. This was originally developed by a group called the Business Rules Group and was later adopted by the Object Management Group, and they published it as an official thing. The Semantics of Business Vocabulary and Rules, or the SBVR. Now, the objective to this in the first place was the definition of business rules for an enterprise. How do you define business rules explicitly? Well, it turns out in order to define business rules, you have to understand the language those rules are expressed in. So while the objectives are for the motivation column of the Zachman framework, the prerequisites are in terms of the semantics that we'll find over in column 1. It's the semantics part that we're interested in here today. But unfortunately, we don't have much time to go into it all. If you're interested, the original definition of this is in the OMG's website, Semantics of Business Vocabulary and Rules, available at this, what it shows here. What I would recommend is the English translation that was developed by Graham Witt in 2012, called Writing Effective Business Rules. And this has the semantics as well as the business rules in detail. But what we're going to do is move on to our third representation, which is the semantic web. Now, back in 1990, Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, which was an incredible vehicle for manipulating documents and pictures and making them shared worldwide. My world was changed with the advent of the World Wide Web, as I'm sure yours was as well. But that wasn't good enough. He and his buddies were concerned because that really didn't tell you about the ideas that are contained in those documents and pictures. What they wanted to come up with was the ability to manipulate those ideas. So their assignment was capture every term in the world, in every language, for each definition with its provenance, is located uniquely on the World Wide Web. Manipulate all terms via natural language sentences. Deal with classes and subclasses. And be sure you can infer assertions from other assertions. Piece of cake, right? From these, 16 years later, they came up with the semantic web. And this consists of the definition of something called a universal resource identifier, which is going to be the location of every term on the internet. And the natural language manipulations are going to be via the Resource Definition Framework, or RDF. And in order to deal with classes and subclasses, you need a specialized version of that, which is the RDF schema, or RDFS. And then finally, in order to do inferences, what you need is the web ontology language called OWL. The Universal Resource Identifier. As we said, every term plus reserved words for each language has an identified location on the World Wide Web. This is called the URI, or Universal Resource Identifier. That sounds suspiciously like a uniform resource locator, and indeed it is. It consists of a URL. For example, here was my URL for my website, which is to say the http essentialstrategies.com. What we're going to add to that, however, is a term that I wish to define on my website. So this is a specific term that is in the context of my website. Specifically, my website is a namespace for the term. The point being that this is unique to that web space. This is the only definition of customer that I can have on my website. Now, I can have lots of other terms, as many terms as I want, but this is the only one I can have in essentialstrategies.com. Now, the little three-letter thing at the top is what's called a Q name, which is an abbreviation for all of this. And specifically, you can say ESI customer, and that is your way of getting that particular URI. Now, if Sean Zachman had his own definition of customer, his Q name could be JAZ, and so JAZ customer gives you John Zachman's definition of customer. By the way, note that these Q names are not inherent in the URI. That is, they are unique to this particular representation of them, or whenever you're referring to it in this script, you can refer to it by this Q name. But somebody else addressing the same URL could put another Q name on it. Note, the Universal Resource Identifier, URI, is not to be confused with the Uniform Resource Locator, or the URL. Think of this as a Jeopardy question. Now, the second element of the semantic web is the language that we're going to use. It's called the Resource Definition Framework, or RDF. This is a structured but natural language way of manipulating terms. Now, each term, plus language reserved words, is a URI. Now, the structure is in terms of triples, and you may remember these from your grammar in grade school: subject, predicate, object. For example, here we have a statement in RDF: Starbucks serves coffee. Starbucks is the subject, serves is the predicate, object is coffee. Note that the owners of each of these URIs, the Q name, if you will, is STB for Starbucks Corporation, MW for Merriam-Webster Dictionary, CGA for the Coffee Growers Association. This, by the way, is made up. Note that each Q name is way simpler than if you spelled out the whole thing as a URI. Now, each of the example we had there is these were individual items, and certainly you can use RDF for all the individual items in the world, but it's more helpful to define categories. And you do this with RDF schema, or RDFS. This is an extension for defining classes and subclasses. Now, if the term is not just an instance, but the name of a group, then that group is called an RDFS class. Now note that RDFS in this case is the Q name for the domain RDF schema, and therefore this URI is a reserved word. So this is reserved for the RDFS language. Now each member of the group is called an RDFS type of that class. So think of RDFS type as an instance of. For example, if coffee shop is a class, then you get coffee shop RDFS type RDFS class, which means that my local Starbucks store on Echo Lane is an instance of coffee shop. That is, STB Starbucks Echo Lane site, RDFS type, is an example of MW coffee shop. So entity types to RDFS classes. Let's go to look at our entity types here. Here you have customer. Customer is an RDFS class. Now, just because it actually should say RDFS type class, this is a very common kludgy. So by convention, we are going to abbreviate that simply as A. So A always means an RDFS type. So customer is a class. Now, note the semicolon. That means that customer as a subject can have multiple predicates. In this example, customer also is defined as a comment. That's the predicate. And the object is this piece of text. And it is a person or it's an organization that has purchased a prototype from the model company. Note the period is the end of the whole statement. Geographic area is another example of an RDFS class. And it has the second predicate of comment, which is defined as a bounded two-dimensional geographic location on the surface of the Earth. City is a class, and that has the comment, geographic area that is recognized in a municipality. But there is something else you note here, and that is that city is a subclass of, and subclass of is another reserved word in RDFS for a geographic area. Okay, attributes. This is another reserved word, data type properties. So here we have an attribute, and customer ID, in this case, is an RDFS data type property. Again, the reserved word for RDFS. Note the semicolon, customer ID also has two other predicates, and all of the properties, both data type and the others we're going to talk about later, have domain and range to clarify what they mean. In this case, the domain is customer, meaning it's an attribute of customer. And range is the data type, the description of what kind of thing it is. In this case, XSD is the Q name for XML, which is the underlying language that is behind all of these. So this is an XML data type. Telephone country code is also a data type property. In this case, the domain is country, and the range it's also a string. Okay, that's data type properties in RDFS reserve word. Okay, now on to the Web Ontology Language, or OWL. This is a further extension of RDFS that allows specification of assertions that can be inferred from other assertions. Now, this is called OWL for short, which is a much more elegant name than WOL. The real reason, however, as I understand it, is that the folks at the WC3 were big fans of Winnie the Pooh. And one of the stories in that series is about a beleaguered character named Owl. He's a very quiet, shy fellow, but once he got in trouble for misspelling his own name as WOL. This caused great sadness. So the folks at W3C weren't going to have any of that. For that reason, in deference to Mr. Milne, Winnie the Pooh, that is to say Owl's creator, they spell their product Owl. This way there won't be any controversy. Owl is much more complex and will be covered in this brief presentation, but it does get involved in specifying and inferring relationships. Now these are what are called object properties. These are the lines that you see here are the relationships. And specifically, you have to be found in is an object property. The domain in this case is customer. And in the case of object properties, the domain is the thing that is being related, and the range is the thing that's being related to. To be found in is a relationship from customer to city. Now, another relationship is home of, and here the domain is city, and the range is customer. Now, notice an interesting thing about home of. It is very much related to and can be inferred from to be found in. Specifically, home of is an object property which is the inverse of to be found in. Okay, continuing. We start with the overview model, a single model of the entire organization made up of multiple semantic data models. This is from the business management point of view, and it's all about definitions, specifically terms, concepts, and definitions. And the vehicle is either entity relationship diagram, object role model, SVBR, or the semantic web in its various flavors. Now we're doing our third kind of business conceptual data models. This is called the essential model, based on John Zachman's Row 3. This is derived, ultimately, from the works of William Ockham, a 14th century logician and friar, to whom is attributed the maxim called Occam's razor. No, it's not that. It is Latin entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem. Now, it is not also, as some of you may have heard, the Latin for don't let the bastards grind you down. That saying also in Latin is about carborundum and illegitimum. But instead, how about entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity? Now we're talking data models. Occam's razor and planning for systems. Simpler designs are easier to build, easier to change, less likely to be changed in the first place, and easier to operate without error. Unnecessarily complex designs are difficult to build correctly, difficult to change, difficult to operate, and prone to error. Complexity is the enemy of data quality. This, of course, raises the question, how complex is unnecessarily complex? How simple is too simple? Well, our friend Albert Einstein was reported to have said, a scientific theory should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. That's not very useful. In fact, it's our jobs as systems developers to come up with the answer to that question. Indeed, it is our job to get rid of unnecessary complexity and leave behind just the right amount. Now, how do we come up with the essential data model? We saw the high level of detail in the semantic model. From many sources, that became a very complex model. What we called in Oracle days the divergent model. Complexity, however, hides underlying simplicity. Simplicity is discovered via patterns. This more abstract model is smaller and therefore convergent. The essential model describes a class of things fundamental to the nature of the enterprise across departments. Now, there are two kinds of data model patterns. Induction, which examine the semantic models themselves to discover patterns in their shapes. This is how I had to do it the first time when I went through all this. Understand that this is hard to do. Deduction takes advantage of published patterns to find similar shapes in what's in your model. This is much easier. Okay, starting with induction. Semantic models themselves have shapes in their patterns. Take a look at our example. Do we see similar shapes? Yeah, there's a sort of else covered thing. How about the sales order and purchase order structure? Are any entity types analogous to each other? Indeed, the structure of a sales order and purchase order is very similar. The only difference is, are we the customer or are we the vendor? For that matter, the portrayal of customer and vendor is really not valid as entity types, because these are not fundamental things, but are roles being played by a person or an organization. You're not born a customer, you're not born a vendor. You have to learn how to do that as time goes on. Now, in whichever role, do we want to limit ourselves to simply buying and selling tangible products? We're selling a product type, we're buying services. That doesn't seem right. Here's another way to simplify the model. Purchase order and the sales order become a contract. That contract is now with one or more persons and organizations. The whole set of persons and the whole set of organizations, we're calling the superset of that a party, which is an abstraction, which is defined as a person or organization which is of interest. Now, note that the customer in and vendor in are roles being played by a party. So either a person or an organization may be a customer, either a person or an organization may be a vendor. Note also that in this model that a contract may be with one or more items, where an item is an abstraction, which is to say either a product or a service. Note that this is just the first draft of an essential model. There are still some issues to be resolved. First of all, note that this model is asserting that each contract is with one and only one party and one and only one party. So you can only have one vendor and one customer. If we sit down with your client, you're going to discover that those are not true. Is it not the case that several parties are participating? Maybe there are multiple customers under one contract. What about other roles, shipper, agent, and so forth? This model will probably require adding another entity type for contract role. Note that each contract may be implemented via one or more contract roles, and each party may be the player of one or more contract roles. That is, each contract role links one contract with one party. There should be an attribute which is the contract role type, or that is one of the possible kinds of role: customer, vendor, agent, shipper, accountant, and so forth. Now, my second problem is with this many-to-many relationship down here between party and geographic area. Anytime there is a many-to-many relationship, that means something is missing. What is the nature of IBM's being located in New York City? Is it a branch office, a headquarters? This will call for adding an intersect entity type, which we're going to call address, where each address links a single party with a single location. Once again, we need a party location type for branch office, headquarters, and so on. And now, from deduction, establish publish patterns and identify similar shapes. Getting patterns from a book. Well, I happen to have this handy-dandy 95 book, which is business-oriented. I have about a dozen standard patterns, the first book of its kind, meaning standard data models to describe standard business situations. I had a follow-up volume in 2011, which, rather than being a single level of abstraction, addressed several levels of abstraction and much more detail. It's this enterprise model patterns describing the world. Now, shortly after I came up with mine, Son Silverstein came up with his data model resource book, which was his version of standard patterns. And then he had a revised edition in 3 volumes from 2001 to 2009. As I said, both of these are business-oriented. We both learned how to model from Richard Barker and took similar modeling technique. Now, object-oriented is a different approach to modeling the business because it doesn't describe the structure so much as the behavior of the classes that are there. I'll talk about that in a moment. But 3 books came out. Martin Fowler and Clay Larman came out shortly after Lynn did in 97 and 98. And Michael Blaha came up with another version, again based on UML, in 2010. I had hung around the object management group people too long, and they kept saying, ER modeling isn't nearly as good as UML. UML can do things that ER modeling can't. And I said, well, yeah, but what you're saying is different. And it took me the longest time to figure out that there was a fundamental difference in the way we looked at things. And so I came up with the book, UML and Data Modeling, A Reconciliation, which specifically addresses the differences between the two ways of looking at things. But because I'd done that, I was able to use my revised version of UML to do my business-oriented conceptual enterprise model patterns book. Because of that, my book is also based on UML, but it's not based on UML. It also uses the UML notation. Now, in addition to this, Paul Ruby in 2006 came up with something called model-driven design using business patterns, but these were revolved around business events. Some enterprise patterns. One of the things I discovered when writing my first book was that you had to choose as to how abstract you made the model. If they weren't abstract enough, the models were not generally applicable. If they were too abstract, nobody can understand them. So I said, I'm going to address multiple levels of abstraction. The first level is the generic model, which is similar to my first book. The categories are who, people and organizations, where, geographic locations, what, physical assets, products and components, activities, how, and time, when. Well, the first 4 had a similar structure that called for a template, a level 0 template. Think of the entity types thing and thing type, and that's the neighborhood. But there also were a couple of business areas that were actually metadata models. The first of this is accounting. Now, accounting has been around for a couple of centuries more as data modeling, but it is, in fact, a model of the entire enterprise. Instead of being concerned with things of significance, it's concerned with quantities of money. And for you trivia experts out there, can any of you think of the word that has 3 sets of double letters? There's only one. Give you a moment to think about 3 sets of double letters. Of course, the word is bookkeeping. Now, the second meta model is the whole issue of document management, which I actually have extended to call information resource management, because it's not just documents, it's not just books, but it is also letters, emails. It also is physical artifacts as well. What is unique of this topic is that each one of these is about something. Each book is about something, which may be something else, anything else in the enterprise model may be referred to in one of these information resources. Now, it's by compounding these patterns, you come up with the why. Why are we in business? We write contracts. We manage people. We manufacture things. We market things. And we have to measure things. This is and then getting even more concrete, you address industries. The first one is criminal justice. Second one is microbiology, banking and finance. Now note that each one of these makes use of the level 0 and level 1 models. Banking and finance is contracts. Microbiology is about physical stuff. Criminal justice is about activities. Oil production is about physical resources, physical assets. Highway maintenance is really about physical assets and networks. So, continuing our previous model, before we took the single overview model and split it out into semantic models, now what we're going to do is consolidate them back again to a single essential data model. The architect's view is representation of the inherent underlying structure of the enterprise. It's in terms of patterns of entity classes, attributes, and relationships, and the vehicle is a consolidated entity relationship model. And all three of these are examples of what we're calling the conceptual data model. Now, you guys all know about Alan Turing's test of how to distinguish a robot or any kind of automaton from real living thing. Basically, can you tell the difference in how they behave? Well, the robot cat passed the Turing test in spades because the robot cat's behavior is to just kind of sit there, and the actual cat's behavior is to just kind of sit there. Can't tell the difference. Part 2, the next session, will be proposed kinds of technology-oriented models. Logical design, which we talked about earlier in this one, are structures that reflect the business, but in terms of a particular approach to database design. And then the physical design is vendor-specific configurations that account for physical constraints. Thank you all for your patience. I know it's been a lot to cover. If you have questions, please write or call. I have a separate email address called Buzzword at davehay.com, and my phone number is always available. The good thing about recording is that you can go back and replay any of the confusing things. Since it has taken over an hour to cover one version of the term conceptual data model, here's a bit more, if you're interested, in another approach to the same ideas. Should add no more than 15 minutes to the session. All of this description of the conceptual data model has actually been about what's called, by a different term, ontology, from Latin in the 17th century current era, which is a branch of metaphysics from Greek in the 4th century before the current era. Now, the word ontology, in fact, has a long history. Its origins go to Aristotle's work called Metaphysics. That branch of speculative inquiry which treats of first principles of things, including such concepts as being, substance, time, space, cause, identity, and so forth. Now, when he died in 322 BC, Aristotle left his collected works in scrolls. Many of these, alas, have been lost to history. Some years after his death, however, an editor sorted out the collection and found works on first principles that we talked about before. These were organized and positioned after his notes on natural philosophy, which is to say, physics. For that reason, this branch of Aristotle's work has been known as afterphysics or metaphysics. I know, again, this is Greek for you. Meta, you see, is the Greek word for after. Then in the 18th century, when Western civilization had moved from Greek to Latin, ontologia was first defined in Latin as the science or study of being. That department of metaphysics which relate to being or the essence of things, or to being in the abstract. Think of ontology as the world's first 300-year-old, actually 2,500-year-old, hot new buzzword. Now, ontology in the 1990s refers to a catalog of terms describing things assumed to exist in a domain of interest, with rules about how those terms can be combined to make valid statements, and the ability to make sanctioned inferences. Now, we can think of our conceptual data model as a kind of ontology. Indeed, it meets all three of the conditions described above. It is defined for a domain, there are rules for making statements, and to some extent you can infer other statements from the first statements. But the world of people viewing the world through ontologies differs from the world that has been building data models, specifically to use as the basis for building corporate databases. This turns out to be an important distinction. Data modeling, as implemented in the relational database world, is about managing data that are corporate assets. The process of building a data model begins with specifying class definitions of fundamental categories, and then he elaborates on each of these to define appropriate attributes for each entity type. Only then does the modeler typically reach out to identify sample instances of each class. These instances are solely for elimination. They are not important to the model itself. An ontology language, on the other hand, is about exploration. Previously, we described the development RDF and the semantic web, but think also about NoSQL. This came later, but it really applies. The ontologist begins with a large body of instances of data. Think of Python reading large documents. From this analysis of documents, one can then identify instances of things. And from these things, one can identify attributes of those instances. The modeler, now let's refer to him or her as an analyst, can then process large groups of instances to infer the instances of classes. As an example, when my son was about 5 years old, he once went around the house trying to collect all possible red things. Mom's lipstick, markers, some of his Matchbox cars, one of the Masters of the Universe figures, and so on. From this, he filled a box, shall we call it a class, of red things. Now, mind you, those objects would be put in different boxes, other classes as well, which means that my 5-year-old identified many examples of multiple inheritance. This Matchbox car is not only a red car, but also a sports car and a convertible. Ontology languages accept multiple inheritance as well. Data modeling and database design is in the role of managing data assets. This involves the closed world assumption. The efforts of data modelers and database designers, for that matter, are to define data which are acceptable. Think of their database as a repository or a safe. Their systems reject data that do not conform. Now, the use of an ontology language, on the other hand, is about exploration. Think RDF and NoSQL. This group makes the open world assumption. The idea is to only assert what is known to be true, but it also, and this is the difference, has the ability to infer what might else be true. For example, in data modeling, each city must be located in one and only one state. If Portland is entered as a city without a state, then it's not accepted. If Portland is entered as a city and linked to the state Maine, then that's great. Now, on the other hand, if Portland is entered as a city and is linked to the state Oregon, that's a problem. Ontology languages, on the other hand, can start with the same source assertion. Each city must be located in one and only one state. Now, Portland may be entered without a state. On the other hand, if Portland is entered as being located in Maine, and Portland is identified as a city, then by implication, Maine must be a state. If, on the other hand, Portland is also entered as being located in Oregon, and Portland is identified as a city, then Oregon must also be a state by inference. Now, at this point, the inference engine takes off and says there's a problem here. Either Oregon and Maine must be the same state, or Portland and Oregon and Portland and Maine must be different cities. Okay, we can infer new information. Even the existing information is not complete. Strange fact, there are 2 different cities in New Jersey named Red Bank. Go figure. To summarize, modeling an enterprise is to create data assets critical to its operation. This makes the closed world assumption. Exploring a large body of data is to discover truth buried in it. This makes the open world assumption. The assumptions affect how you go about your business. Speaking of discovery, here you have our cavemen who have found an elephant. Aha, I discovered an elephant. Look, we got him. Not noticing that behind the elephant there is something much larger. Now you can purchase this book, which has been the subject of this whole presentation, by going to our publisher, which is at techniquespub.com/buzzword. And if you use this code, ABC30, you'll get a 30% discount. Again, I thank you for your patience. If you have any questions, please write or call. Again, the email address is there, and so is the telephone number. Thank you all.